Welcome to Sacred, the podcast that invites you to reclaim your intuition, resist exploitive systems, and remember the love that brought you to teaching and caregiving in the first place.
We're your hosts,
Angela Carolina Garcia
and Lauren Staubel. Join us on a rough and tumble journey of reckoning and transformation. Hey listeners, today we have with us Wheeler DeAngelis. He is an early childhood educator. Angela and I both taught in the same center as Wheeler. And then Wheeler and I moved on to a second center together. So we just keep coming back, and we are so excited to talk with him today. First, let's just take a moment to arrive here. So wherever you are, if it's safe to close your eyes, you can do that. It feels right. And we have in the Northeast, we've had a lot of water lately. We're losing some crops for the amount of water that we had, and thinking about, kind of balancing out water with some air today. So as you're taking in some breath, inhale, and experience the air quality of the breath. And then exhale, release. And as you are paying attention to your breath, see if you can notice the texture of the breath, the pacing, the depth, and let go of any need for it to be a certain way. Just see how it is. And you can stay in that inquiry if you want to, or you can take it a little bit further. And with your next inhale, feeling that airy movement of the breath, see if you can feel the breath reaching out even through the arms, shoulders, arms, wrists, hands, fingertips. And then exhale back into center. Maybe this one with the inhale, moving air through hips, legs, knees, lower legs, ankles, feet, toes. And then back in through center. Just kind of allowing the breath to bring you into this space. Allow it to breathe you. And allow yourself to feel light where you are right now. And as you are ready, if your eyes were closed, you can begin to gently open them and then reconnect with the space that you are in right now. So if you're seeing other people, you might make eye contact and smile. You might just look around at what's in the room with you or outdoors with you. And let's get started. You guys ready?
Oh, yeah.
I'm ready.
Okay. So Wheeler, we would love to hear from you first. It's interesting. We've known you for a while now, but I don't think we have ever discussed this before. Tell us just a little bit more about yourself for the listeners, and specifically the love that brought you to the world of children in the first place.
Well, as may be clear from my very deep voice, I'm a man who works in early childhood, which is, a pretty rare occurrence, an unfortunately rare occurrence. I think, I think a lot of men are sort of pushed away from early ed because of the emotional side of the work, which is one of the reasons that brought me into it, is that, I went to the University of Connecticut, and there's two tracks for education there. There's the School of Education and the School of Human Development. And in the School of Education, I was talking to a lot of students there, and they were very focused on becoming principals. And I was like, well, but isn't the point of teaching to work with children and be involved in their day-to-day lives? I don't want to be a principal. I want to be a teacher. And so I found a home in the early childhood program where people were very focused on meeting children where they were and working with the whole person and, building children up to be their best selves. I'm currently working at Boston University in Boston, obviously, which is great. We have a great program. It's very young. It used to be sort of like, we joke about it, the one-room schoolhouse. It used to be like one preschool classroom with like 35 children and 7 teachers in it, which seems like, I don't know how they got licensed to do that, but somehow.
Must have been before 2003.
Right. And so now we just transitioned, actually during COVID, we transitioned into a new building, and now we're a 7 classroom center with an infant program and a toddler program. And so it's been really great to be a part of sort of like building that out and, getting out in the Boston University community and sort of, teaching people about the resource that we are, both to parents who are working for the university, but also to students who can come and do observations on campus in our classrooms and get real experience with young children. I can't tell you how many occupational therapy students I've worked with who are like, oh my God, you have 3-year-olds we can work with? And it's like, yes, like get in here.
Yeah.
We need your expertise.
That's so fun.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity. And I think, this is the 4th university childcare center that I have worked for. And I think that there's something magical about sort of the overlap of universities teaching missions and early childhood teaching missions, and how like those two things interact in a really fun way and like give children a bigger community to be a part of and open college students up to like understanding that their work can, be as, expansive as they want to be. They don't have to be a 3rd grade teacher. Like they can take their love of teaching and they can take it to a toddler room and still be, experiencing all of those wonderful things that their professors are talking about in elementary schools with younger children.
I love that you say that, because when I think of like my own journey into early childhood and into teaching, all I ever wanted was to be a classroom teacher. Even when I think of like retirement or what would a retirement plan be, I see myself working in a classroom with 3-year-olds, with 4-year-olds. Hopefully I'm still learning at that time, whenever that time comes. But to be a teacher, I think, is something that we don't get to talk a lot about, even though we are teachers, because the track usually is outside of the classroom eventually. Like that is where it sort of leads you. I mean, for my own self, like I'm not in the classroom anymore for multiple reasons. And I don't see myself going back into the classroom until a very different point in my life. So I'm thinking a lot about that and how like we can frame it that like, no, you can be a teacher and you can stay in the field. And I think you've explained that, like you've shared that really well and wonderfully.
Yeah. And I think that that's one of the reasons that early childhood is sort of like stuck in this mire that it's been in since the 50s, is that like, it is very horizontal, and in a public school system, you can be a teacher's aide and then a teacher and then a program coordinator and then an assistant principal and then a principal and then go up to district level. There's a job trajectory. Whereas in early ed, you're a teacher. And then if you're good enough at being a teacher, they'll drag you into admin where all of the joy will get sucked out of your life and you'll not be using the skills that you love. Eventually you'll turn into a dried up husk and you'll leave the field. So I think that that's one of the things that we as sort of, thinkers in early ed need to figure out is like, how do we create space for people to grow professionally within early ed, but also not push people into new roles. Like if you're a great teacher, you should be able to just be a great teacher. You shouldn't have to then go be a mediocre admin because you were such a great teacher.
Right. It's making me think of, like right now you said, like, the professional trajectory within education or within teaching, which then makes me think about like all of a sudden Aristotle and like Roman and Greek philosophers came to my head just now that you said that. And I was like, they didn't have a trajectory for where they were going to go professionally. Like they were teachers and they taught, and like that's what they're known for the wisdom that they have given to the world. And we don't get, I think that because of the way that education exists in our context or in our country, that the idea is that you're always moving up, right? Like that's a condition of capitalism, is always to move. Like you can never just be, you're always moving forward. But like when you think of what teaching is, it's to be in relationship with humans. It is to bring ideas together. It is to evolve and expand ideas, which expanding isn't a ladder, right? It like expands, like the breath expands, right?
Yeah, this has been a very interesting journey for myself because I've recently moved up into a more support role. I'm not technically in the classroom anymore. I'm the mentor teacher at BUCC. Mm-hmm. So I work with all of the teachers in the infant-toddler program. And I think the reason that I got the job was because I showed up to the interview and I had a 3, 5, 10, and 15-year plan and like what I wanted to do, like with the program and with the teachers and where I wanted to go. And I'm realizing, now being in my third year of this role, that the 3-year plan is the 15-year plan. Like like people, not everybody goes at the same speed and not everybody has the same goals. And like, it's okay to just sort of like work on one project a little bit at a time until it's mastered. And then to also like spend time and enjoy that mastery and not be like, this thing is done, throw it out and bring me the next thing to do.
I remember that from, being in some campus programs are lab schools. And so every campus has pressure to be doing the latest, whatever the latest research is showing. But what we know about research is that it's really not, it's conducted in a vacuum. It's very hard to apply education research in the moment, especially in infant and toddler classrooms, I would say. Preschool too, as well, but especially with infants and toddlers and the unique relationships that infant toddler teachers have with babies and with parents is just, when I was first an infant teacher, I was like, I have got to get out of here right away. Like, this is so intense. These people are sleep deprived and they're leaving the most important thing in their life for the first time with us. Like, this is just way too, and you mentioned the emotional nature of the work. This is way too emotional for me. And I was like, I'm going to go back to school for engineering. This is the least emotional work I can think of. So I started actually preparing to leave the field, and I ended up, that's a long story, but I ended up staying in the field, kicking and screaming, and now have come, probably about when I met both of you, really beginning to understand the strength of the emotional nature of the work and how, this theme keeps coming up for us, how our growth, and we were talking before the recording started about kind of how personal growth is professional development for early educators, but that we grow best in relationship to children, and children are like our provocation for our development, really. That this is actually a symbiotic thing, which actually kind of leads me to not do this on purpose, but it's leading me to the next question for you, Wheeler, which is that you probably know by now we have a long-term vision of community that's rooted in sacred relationships. So in teaching and caregiving, it's this unexplainable connection that we sense. Like it's hard to describe. Sometimes that connection comes from like immense frustration. So it's full spectrum, right? And sometimes it's like deep joy. But the way that we feel and respond to each baby and each group of children is unique. And I think, part of that is why I kept coming back. And now it's with the adults that I teach. But what does sacred relationships mean to you in early childhood? Or I know you're a new dad, so feel free to go there too.
Well, that's been a whole different empathy building experience. It's interesting. You mentioned this idea of sort of like teachers also being learners. Something that I've been saying a lot with the college students that I work with, who, are often asking like, how do I be a good teacher? What's a good teacher? And so I've been saying to them, the only bad teacher is a teacher who thinks they have nothing left to learn. Like you have to go in every day realizing that like I'm going to see some stuff today that I think I know what it is. And when I sit down and think about it, I'm going to realize I was wrong. And I have to like be okay with that and process those feelings quickly enough to like turn it around and be helpful to the children in my care. But yeah, the idea of a sacred relationship, I think when I think of that, it's really that we, parents trust us, give early childhood teachers a tremendous amount of trust over this like very precious thing, which is their child. And we have to be both good partners to those parents and, being trustworthy, but also sort of like be the experts. And I think that that's a thing that a lot of people are really afraid of, is like sort of sitting in their expertise and saying like, I've seen a lot of children and I know that this behavior is typical or isn't typical. And here's some examples of things that I have done that have worked and things I've done that haven't worked. And then letting go and letting parents make their own decisions, which is something that is very hard for me. And I've only recently sort of felt comfortable doing, is like giving a parent all of the information that I think that they need, and then just sort of like giving them time and space and not checking in on it and waiting for them to come back and talk to me about it, and not, sending 1,000 emails. It's like, hey, did this new schedule work for, Johnny? Because that's going to make it, being an observed phenomenon is always, sorry, oh, man, I lost that quote. Observing a phenomenon always changes it. Observing a phenomenon always changes it. That's a Heisenberg principle. When you observe a phenomenon, it changes. So I think that our role is to be sort of like, trail guides instead of lifeguards, which is like, we should tell parents and children what's ahead. We should tell them what's fun about it and what's not fun about it, but we shouldn't be in charge of whether or not they're running around.
And that, like, first of all, that brought like so much validation, but also peace. And I think that when you're working as a teacher, and right, like we come into the field of teaching, whether it's K-12 or early childhood, because we want to be with children, we want to play with them. We think we have so much wisdom and we want to teach them and we want them to be successful. And there's a lot of control that comes with that, right? Like whether it's the way that we're educated to have this control, like we're also taught how to have classroom management and how to create schedules, and like sometimes even like how to like help children not choke. Like we know all of this information. So we are experts, and then we have relationships with parents and administrators that are like, but you can't actually do that, and we're not going to pay you because we can't afford it or we don't want to. But then when you said, but you like give them the information and then you let it go, and you're a trail guide versus a lifeguard. It's like, oh, like that kind of is like, oh, I can like probably do the work a little bit more, because I can't control what a parent decides, and I can't control what an administrator decides, and I can't even control what the state regulates for me to know or not know, but I can regulate how I'm going to be in relationship with those external factors or other situations.
Absolutely. And I feel like it's one of the ways that I've been talking with the teachers who I work with about it recently, is that, we had a lot of conversations about children misbehaving, which is like I hate, because, like what is appropriate behavior? Like it's so contextual, but understanding that children arrive at every situation with the tools that they have and they do the best they can. And so if the behavior that you're experiencing is not the behavior you want, it is your job as the teacher to help to create the behavior that you want to see, to give the skills to those children so that they can behave in the way that you hope they will behave. And you can't control the behavior. You can't like force them into, the tiny little box that is the perfect behavior, but you can move the ball 1 yard at a time. You can get, this kid who at the beginning of the year is kicking and screaming and biting his friends to sit down somewhere in the room during circle time, and then maybe sit a little closer the next day, and then a little closer. And then, 3 months later, maybe he's being involved in some way. And like, that's a titanic shift. And teachers need to recognize that, like, that's the job done. Like you have succeeded with that child. Like it's getting them to be your best behaving child is not always attainable, but getting them to be their best selves is always attainable.
I'm so glad you're saying this because I'm teaching a curriculum class at the moment. And quite frankly, I had no idea what I signed myself up for when I said, sure, I'll teach that class in the summer. And it's a 5-week course. And they wanted us to meet 3 times a night for 3 hours every single night. That's 9 hours in 3 days of knowledge and information. And like, not only like the expectation of the students and all of the work for them, but also like, I have all this work to do now, 9 extra hours of work after a full day's work. But I really started right when I was like designing the class and what I wanted it to look like. I was like, what is curriculum, right? Like, what is it to develop curriculum? And what does that look like? And what does that feel like? And what is the breadth of it? Breath is coming a lot to me today too, Lauren. But so I sat with my students on Monday and I went through the thing. And then I said, everyone goes in their small groups. This is the expectation of how we're supposed to meet. And someone like came off me and said, I can't do that. And I was like, okay, go to the small groups. And please describe your hopes and dreams of what you would like this class to look like for you for the next 5 weeks with the capacity that you have. And so they went to their small groups and then they came back and they really said like, our hopes and dreams are we meet once a week and everything else is asynchronous. And I said, okay, we're going to adjust the class. And so like right there and then, like we adjusted the class and we adjusted the syllabus and.
Oh boy. Everybody knows that the best communities are always built in vacuums, right?
Right. And they were like, wait, really? Like we can really change that this way? We can really do that to our class? And I was like, yeah, like it's our class, it's our curriculum. Yeah. And so, and they really talked a lot. Like I asked them, what did that experience feel like? And they said like we have a sense of that we have a voice and that we have autonomy and that we have agency and that we do have the right to ask for what we need. And then like, I think I ended the class with like, and remember that when you're developing curriculum for your babies. See you in 2 weeks. Goodbye.
I recently had to stop using the word curriculum because I was getting into these like mires with the teachers I was working with where I would like describe something as curriculum and they wouldn't be able to grasp it because I would, for me, curriculum is a roadmap to the learning that's going to take place. Like and curriculum can be so many things. A conversation can be curriculum, but it can also be a 400-step plan that's like got specific dates to each of those things. And so I was describing specifically, we use name symbols at BUCC. Each child has a unique symbol that, is simple enough that they can create it themselves at 18, draw it themselves at 18 months, and then it's unique to them. So they can label things with it. Often classrooms will have like labeled blocks so you can save a space for this child when they go to the bathroom. And I often describe that as the symbol curriculum. And people are always like, how is this a curriculum? Like, what does it do? And it's like, it's a long-term trajectory about literacy development that we start with our infants and we continue through toddlerhood and until the children leave here. Like that, if that's not curriculum, I don't know what is. Like, it doesn't have to be written out.
Right.
That reminds me of when when you and I worked together, Wheeler, I was in charge of recruiting and hiring. And I was like, you know what the problem is? We don't have enough people who studied education here, who set out to be teachers. So it's like everybody we're hiring this year is going to have set out to be a teacher. And then the next year I was like, we need the artists and the poets. We need abstract thinkers. We need people who see a conversation as curriculum. And I think, that's kind of gets to the next thing of like what interrupts with the issues that interrupt the sacredness of teaching and caregiving relationships. I think, I haven't really thought about it in that way before, but sometimes it's just literal thinking. And because relationships are not literal. I am a literal thinker, by the way, so there is absolutely no judgment on literal thinkers. There are a lot of interesting conversations in my house that come from the flow between abstract and literal thinking. But I think there is, and I teach early childhood education. So I'm thinking about how am I going to prepare people for this work that cannot be described, that is, I have 4 months less than 16 weeks. I have 16 weeks with these people. Somehow, the curriculum course is a great example. This is the only class that somebody might take in the state of Massachusetts if they're going to be a lead teacher of children 5 and younger. So I have 16 weeks to get them somehow the most, hard to describe skills that they will, but of course you were saying, okay, the 3-year plan becomes the 15-year plan. I've had to let go of a lot of that. I guess part of sacred relationships is being able to let go of, understand where my edges are and in the beginning of you, right? Sometimes we overlap, but
yeah. Well, and Lauren, I will say, as somebody who went through an undergraduate program for early childhood ed, stayed on and did sort of like the advanced student teaching curriculum at a university that is known for its early ed program, that is very good, that is a lab school. Like, the first time I got into the classroom, I had no idea what I was doing, because there is this sort of like confluence of reality and preparation that like teachers need to have both. So I think it's really hard to prepare students because the world is such a varied place that I might be preparing you to walk into one of my classrooms, but I don't know if I'm preparing you to walk into a classroom in El Salvador or, wherever it is that you might end up. I do think that one of the beautiful things about early ed is that there is sort of like 2 tracks. There's the academic track to get in and the practice track. And so, there are teachers out there who have 35 years of experience and no associate's degree, and people out there with master's degrees who've never walked into a classroom. And in early ed, we have both of those people holding space and in conversation with each other, which I think is really powerful. But it is also something that really interrupts the sacred relationship, because we are constantly negotiating amongst ourselves, oh, well, Piaget said blah, blah, blah. But, well, actually, I've never seen a child ever create a schema in real life. So, what does that look like?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Are there other, is there, feel free to stay on that issue or another one that interrupts sacred relationships, but is there a moment or situation that kind of forced you to reckon with those issues?
Yes. I mean, many.
So many.
I'm a person who sometimes empathy feels like a second language to me, meaning I come to it not naturally. It's something that I'll often have to pause and be like, no, this person, I need to be nicer to this person. I need to rein myself in. And when I was working at, Brandeis, the center where we all worked, I had a interaction with a mother that really sort of made that I now think back on much differently than I thought of in the moment. We decided not to have a Mother's Day celebration. We had several children in the family with complicated, close family relationships. We had a 2-mom family. We had a single parent. We had a single parent by choice and a single parent not by choice. We had a lot. It was very complicated. And so we decided what is the value of this? The children don't understand what Mother's Day is. We're just going to let this ship pass us by and, not wave at it. And then Mother's Day passed. And one mother came into my classroom very, very upset with me specifically because I had sent out the email explaining why we weren't going to celebrate Mother's Day. And so, she said, this is ridiculous. I pay so much, which is my least favorite argument, but is one that often gets brought up in early ed settings. I pay so much for this. And, what she said is all of my friends have totems from their children. Well, she said drawings. But all my friends have these things that their children made, at school and gave to them as like a symbol of their love. And, me in the moment as a 24-year-old, I was like, wait, you want me to like write you a card and then take, your child's hand and stick it on there and hand it to you? Like, how is that a symbol of his affection for you? Like, that's just me doing it. But in reality, what she was saying was, I'm needing affirmation. Like, I work really hard, and this is, as I'm learning now, parenting is an incredibly difficult process. And she just needed some affirmation that like she was doing a good job and her child was thinking about her and cared about her. And me being stuck in my academic track was like, well, there's no educative value to a Mother's Day card. When like really there's a relational value to that Mother's Day card. And I still like in my heart of hearts, I still like don't think that teachers should be making Mother's Day cards at school, because like that's the family's job. Like, it should be on the other family members to be celebrating their familial relationship. But I understand that like there's so much benefit to fostering those feelings of warmth and affection and community in the classroom that like sometimes we can sacrifice educational time in order to do these community building activities.
That when you said sacrificing educational time, that just went straight to my heart there, because it's something I struggle with. And as Angela and I learn more and more about healing-centered education, we are in, came up once already, we're in a capitalist context in which relationships are really second to making money or making a profit or even survival, right? Because that's the world we're living in right now. But community is essential to being successful. It's like in one of the other episodes we recorded, the vision for thriving included like community was at the core of that answer. And so I spend the first day of class, and like you did, Angela, like in the first day of class, we're not going over content. We're learning how to be with each other. We're deciding how we're going to be with each other. And that is considered a waste of time in other spaces. And even as we think about the kind of professional development that we want to offer, that Angela and I do offer, it's going to be a small audience that we're speaking to that sees the value and plus has the resources to include that amount of time. But it's so important to actually doing the work, to getting work done. And I'm the kind of person where, I love a good agenda in a meeting. I want to know why are we here? How long are we going to be here? What are we talking about? Well, and why are we talking about it? Right. But when I jump right into that, because I value that everybody has made this time, I have learned, thank you, Angela, that it's really worth catching up a little before jumping into an agenda. Like,
absolutely. Yeah. So in my role, I run a lot of meetings, sort of like, mini professional developments or team meetings or program meetings or what have you. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with SRI, the School Reform Institute. Oh yeah. Fantastic. I have a very thumbed over copy of their manual, but so I often run protocols out of that book, which I think everybody should read.
I'm pretty sure mine is right here.
Yeah, see the binder. I have started doing connections at the beginning of those meetings. And when I started doing connections, for listeners, is like a 10-minute period of relative silence where people can talk about what was happening to them before the meeting and not be responded to. So it's just sort of like a way for everybody in the meeting to get out what they're bringing into the meeting with them and hear each other out. And I had so many people telling me like, this meeting was great, except for those 10 minutes in the beginning, which were a waste of time. And blah, blah. And it's like those 10 minutes in the meeting made it so that everybody was present and ready to go on minute 11. And like, if we hadn't taken those 10 minutes, we would have had 35 minutes of somebody thinking about what's going on in their classroom, and another person squirming around in their chair to get comfortable, another person getting up and going to get water. So we took 10 minutes, we all got on the same page, and then we did the meeting. And the meeting was great because we were all prepared for it.
And connections is a hard one, especially for the first time, because 2 minutes feels like an eternity when nobody is speaking. And so it's like, and as the facilitator even, it's like, whew, take a breath. Okay, I don't have to do anything right now. Like, my job is just to hold space for people. And that takes practice, especially when, right, my students their lives are full. Everybody's lives are full, but my students' lives are especially full. And to make space in that fullness is like, whoa, what is that? What is that thing? And it takes time, but it is once you settle into it, right, with the protocols, also people resist protocols sometimes because and I work in higher ed, I brought a protocol also from SRI, the tuning protocol. So we look at somebody's work, we find out what their goals are for their work, and then we offer feedback based on that person's goals for their work. The group that I was planning with, the word protocol just shut them down. And they were like, I don't know what this is. That seems too structured. But what I let my students know when I introduced the protocol is that, some people are internal processors, some people are external processors. If we create space, and I'm an internal processor, if we create space for internal processors to hear themselves think, then they will say more they'll contribute more during a meeting or during a protocol. So, sometimes it feels rigid, but it actually, there's a yoga philosophy now, like boundaries equals freedom, like just creating some guardrails to say, hey, here's what we're doing today. Because one of my yoga teachers says, like, you can do that if you want, but it's not what we're doing today. So like, if you go, like, this is what we're doing today. But it is like magic at the end. Like I have, as the person bringing the work and facilitating and also participating, there is a kind of transformation that can take place in a very short amount of time, as long as you follow the protocol. Mostly.
Well, and I think that early ed is full of, let's be honest, neurodivergent people. It's full of people who've had like a lot of trauma in education and are like trying to process their childhood trauma by working with children, and people who, like, for those structures seem really frightening. And I think that there's a real sort of like magic to understanding that, like, agendas and structure equal equity. Like, they make it so that every person in the room understands what's expected of them, understands where this meeting is going to go, understands how much time they have, and can get out those ideas. The teacher who's as quiet as a mouse in every meeting because she doesn't know, how long this conversation is going to go. There's a piece of paper in front of her that says, hey, this topic is 10 minutes. Maybe at minute 9, she's going to say, oh, this is important to me. I'm going to get this out now because I know this conversation is ending soon.
Unlearning is coming up for me. Like the process of unlearning, right? And even when we're going through our tracks of however we end up in education, specifically in early childhood, there's a lot of learning that goes into the structures and the discipline and the guidance and the boundaries that has to be created for young children to be successful, right? And you can learn that whether you've worked with children for 35 years and you've just played and figured that out for yourself, or you did study Piaget and Vygotsky and all of those people at the master's level. But there's something about adult relationships that piece of flexibility doesn't translate, right? Like, we're in these meetings with our colleagues and we're like, we have to get it started. Like, let's go. And the same empathy that we have for young children, or that we're developing or hoping to have for young children, doesn't always exist with our coworkers. And I think and right now when you said, like, no, that's how we are creating equitable spaces for each other. I think, like, how wonderful or how beautiful or how magical it would be if we thought of our colleagues as also needing the same amount of empathy and space and care that we like also provide for our students. I think like that's something that I've been thinking a lot about, especially when I started working with like the embodied lab and what does that look like for everybody. And at the time I was doing it in the context of my own healing and being a better teacher for adults. And it just sort of like meshed into that world. But right now, as we're talking, I'm like, oh, it's different. It's different for adults than it is for kids. And for kids, it comes so much easier, right? Like, I think it's so much easier.
I mean, how many times have you been in a preschool classroom and your group time is going off the rails and you're like, this isn't productive for any of these kids. Let's transition out of this and go do something else. But
right.
You never dream of doing that in a meeting with adults where we have stuff we have to talk about. And it's like, no, like this meeting isn't productive. These teachers are obviously like somewhere else. Like, let's come back and do this at a time when people can really do it.
Yeah. I'm surprised by my students because when I decided I was going to be an adjunct professor for early childhood, soon to be teachers or refreshers for already teachers or administrators, I was like, how am I going to build into that all of the work that I've learned about embodiment and social justice without like creating a textbook or, well, not creating a textbook, but providing a textbook on this is what it looks like. Please read 20 pages on social justice and anti-bias education. And my students are consistently surprised when I say, well, if no one else has any questions and I have said what I have said and we can leave class an hour early, like we can be all done. They're like, really? Really? The other day, one of my students said, a lot of like my homework assignments, I don't actually care how you turn in your homework assignment to me. As long as it gets to me, you let me know it's coming. It can be a painting, it can be a poem, it can be a drawing, as long as the context and the outcomes and the objectives are expressed. And one of my students was like, it says drawing and I'm really nervous about it. I don't know what to do. And I was like, oh, well, what do you feel comfortable? Like, what kind of modality of expression do you feel comfortable? She's like, I can write you a poem. And I said, okay, great. Like, you can. She was like, really? I can do that? And that for me is mind blowing. And maybe 5 years ago it wouldn't have been, but like today, I'm like, wait, like, what do you mean you weren't allowed to be able to express your understandings in a way that felt good to you? I don't think I would have ever, like, when I think of my own education and in college, I don't think I would have ever said, like, can I just write you a poem? Like, that wasn't even an option, right? Like, you had to turn in a 10-page paper.
Well, and that's like, that's valuing process over product. Not to bring it up a third time, but like, capitalism is constraining the human experience. But we have this like focus that's driven into everybody so early on that like what matters is the product. If your paper is good, you'll get a good grade and then you will be successful in life. And it doesn't matter if you learned anything getting to that paper. It doesn't matter if you read books to get it or if you just like talked to somebody on the street and had a really powerful conversation that changed the way you thought about something, because all that matters is the product. And so many, I work, with so many teachers who like, well, but how are we going to get our children to do, how do we get our children to be successful in, life? And it's like, you just teach them the processes of success. Like you just like, teach them how to be in their own body. And then when they get to elementary school, they're going to be more successful with math and science because they're going to be comfortable sitting in their chair and they're going to know how they learn best. And they're going to be able to build successful partnerships with their peers in a group project. And like, that's really the value that we can bring as early childhood educators, is building children that really great foundation of self-understanding by not caring about what the product is and only like really valuing their process.
Well, and this is where, Wheeler, you mentioned, okay, there's a high concentration of neurodivergence in early childhood educators. I have ADHD, and I've always said people with ADHD make excellent preschool teachers because we don't care about being interrupted every 2 minutes. We are terrible. If somebody walks into the room and is like, how many children do you have? We're like, 1, 2, 3. But we know everybody's there. It's like, but people who are neurodivergent usually don't have a problem being in the process. Not always, and sometimes they really prefer structure. So there's a wide neurodivergence, of course. There's neurodiversity within neurodivergence, of course, really wide ranges. But that resistance to fitting into a mold that usually neurodivergent people, that's their strength. That is the value that we bring to the field, is to say like, that tag is uncomfortable. Yeah, of course it is. Like that's just.
Well, and ADHD, OCD, autism spectrum disorders, these are diseases of capitalism. These are things that in a world where a person's value wasn't judged by their productivity would not be problems. They're just different ways of being in the world. And so often we are trying to get children to fit into this Norman Rockwell perfect preschooler model, when what does it matter if they kick their legs at snack? If that's what it takes for them to feel comfortable while they're eating, what skin is it off my back?
Yeah, I think that there are these external pressures, right, of I'm supposed to quote unquote prepare them for kindergarten. And we've talked about this a little bit in previous conversations, of to say actually we're just, living. We're preparing kids to be alive, to continue being alive. This is how humans are. We are humans being. And so that is okay. So then we have all these other things. So when these interruptions take place, we really believe that there's whatever spirituality means to each of us, that spirituality really kind of holds the power of helping us, find our ground again, and keep coming back to the process. Say something about that in your own experience.
Yeah, I mean, spirituality is a really tough experience. I was raised sort of Catholic, very sort of straight down the line Roman Catholic. And so obviously that was very traumatic for everyone who goes through it. I've been processing it for many years. But so I made a hard break with the idea of spirituality in my late teens, because I was this is dumb, and why would I ever think about anything I can't touch? But I have been realizing, especially sort of with the new child in my family, that there's a lot of meaning in that sort of process beyond your own body, and tapping into your community and having deeper connections with people because you have these shared beliefs. And I think I have only, very recently begun that part of my spiritualism journey, and I'm very excited to see how it affects my classroom practice. In the classroom, I think that it's funny because, we were talking about this off mic the other day about sort of the teacher mask, which is this idea that teachers have some perfect persona in the classroom, and, that covers up who they really are in order to be the best teacher, with big quotation marks. And how, we all need to smash our teacher mask. We all need to be our real selves in front of children so that they can see what the real human experience looks like, and sort of embrace the fullness of that, negative and positive. Children need to know what it looks like to be happy, but they also need to know what it looks like to be frustrated. I feel that's sort of where I find spirituality in the classroom, is the idea that I am providing an example for children of what a human experience could be, and I think it's additionally important because I am frequently the only man they will see in the building until they get to elementary school, because, for a lot of dumb social reasons. But, being able to show that men can care for you too, men love you, men, it's not, I think that this generation of children, Gen Alpha, is sort of like going to be very beyond the idea of gender, which is very exciting. But I do think that there's still, here in my New England bubble, I think that might be the case. But I think that there's still a lot of places where, you go fishing with dad and you talk about sports and you never talk about your feelings. And like, that's so harmful to that relationship because like, then you don't really know them. And then they're not really a resource for you in times of trouble when you're having a hard time. So I think that my presence in the room is enough to sort of like show some children that they can reach out to the men in their lives. But it also, there are definitely kids who like are very afraid. I had a preschooler this year who I walked in the classroom and she like put down the pencil she was using and got up and walked to the other side of the classroom. And I was like, okay, I'm tracking that. I know that that's something that we're going to have to deal with. And so I talked to her teachers and she's, comes from a single mother family and has like it was raised by her mother and her grandmother, has had like no interactions with, men in any sort of personal context. So I was like, okay, well, like I'm going to make it my mission to like have a gentle introduction to this child and like open up her ability to sort of like be in the world. Like that is my goal for this child for the year. And still ongoing, obviously, because like that work is never done, but it felt really important to like be able to help that child expand their world in that way.
That's a lot of the work that we as teachers in early childhood do that I don't think is valued or noticed outside of the classroom space. This like we are providing experiences of the world in this moment of like 0 to 5, right? Like in 0 to 5, they're learning so much, right? Like most of their brain development is happening in this moment. And we get to explore the world with them for the very first time. And I think about like that immense amount of responsibility that we have as teachers, but like the world outside of early childhood doesn't value or doesn't even understand, right? Like they're thinking writing and math and colors and
there's a term that I love, expatiate, which is expatiate means to take an experience and then to give it space to expand into something else.
Mm-hmm. Oh, there's air again.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm thinking a lot about like, I think in the moment you were describing, you left, like you said, no thank you to spirituality. And now you're a parent and it's like, oh, what does that look like? Like I need to tap into something other than this thing here. I'm exploring that. And it's like, it sounds like you're like reclaiming your own transformation in this process in the new spaces that you're like in the new space that you're in. And it's like rough and tumble. It feels like, right? Rough and tumble's
very
my
much
favorite. So. And it's really like intrinsically motivated, right? Like nobody said, you're a parent now, go back to your spirituality. Just sort of like, oh, this is this new thing. And sometimes it's painful because we do remember those traumatizing moments. And like we're trying to figure out like ourselves and the relationship with others. And can you tell us a little bit about your rough and tumble aspects and within your reflective practice as you do this work?
Yeah. I mean, I said earlier, like, the only bad teacher is a teacher who doesn't think they have anything left to learn. I think that has been definitely a journey for me to get there, to like, realize that it's okay to not have answers for things, which is definitely something that I still like struggle with. I sort of built a reputation as a young teacher of like being in a parent conference and like having 10 pages of notes about everything that could possibly be talked about in that conference so that I could like have a research study that I could give the parents, like have a book that I could read. And like doing that was so exhausting because it was like, well, I mean, obviously like finding all of those resources is exhausting, but also because it's not acknowledging what actually is supposed to be happening in those conferences, which is like building community and talking to each other and being resources in person rather than trying to externalize those resources so that they can talk to an expert and like prove your expertise by how much you know about the resources that are out there. So it's definitely, so bringing that back in and like, you know, saying to parents like, oh, that sounds hard. Why don't you tell me more about it? Instead of like, oh yeah, I've seen that before and here's the way that we fix it. Has definitely been a growth experience for me. Also like working with other teachers. I worked with one co-teacher for a really long time, which was great. We built like a really good working relationship together. But then, you know, when you work with somebody for a really long time, you sort of like forget how to work with other people. And then like moving into a position where I'm like working with everybody in the infant-toddler program, you have to work with different work styles. You have to give people enough space. You have to be really fast for the people who need you to be fast and really slow for the people who need you to be slow. And sometimes really slow for the people who think they want to go fast because they don't actually know. Like they're running away from something, and you have to be the anchor that says like, okay, when you're ready, we're going to come back and we're going to talk about this thing.
Yeah.
I love that imagery I just got. I was like, oh yeah, my ADHD just loves that thing. We've been studying the concepts of shape shifting, which is there is a Hindu deity, Hanuman, and his energy is shape shifting in order to respond in the moment. He's also a trickster, so he can change forms based on the moment in order to bring a sense of humor or playfulness when it's needed. But I'm thinking about leadership, even in ECE, and probably leadership in general, being that shape shifting is such an important part of that role. And just as you were saying at the beginning, like some people are great educators with young children, and maybe it's because they can shape shift with children. But if that doesn't translate to doing that work with adults, then it won't look good. It won't feel good. And so I'm bringing us, I guess it's bringing itself back for us, thinking about, a world where people who want to be teachers get to be teachers with a beautiful quality of life. Like that's my vision. But what about you? In terms of, shifting from surviving to thriving, and I wonder if your union work fits in here into this question, or, feel free to touch on that or not. But what would that world look like where we are actually thriving?
It's tough because like, I think that the real answer is like, it has to be much smaller. Like, I think that the ever expanding nature of our world has made it really hard to keep communities together and to sort of like have shared experiences. Like I live in Somerville, which is like a very sort of community centric place. There's, festivals all the time. There's the Somerville Arts Council. There's, meetings of our local ward that we go to frequently. I still don't know most of my neighbors. I've lived here for, almost 10 years. And I think that that's just, the nature of life these days is that it's very individual. And I think that in order to thrive, people need to get back to not being so individual and sort of like thinking about each other as people and then themselves as members of their community. I think a lot about sort of like the way that early childhood is practiced in Italy. I'm of Italian descent. And so I sort of like, think a lot about like the Reggio process and how parents are brought into the classroom, like physically into the classroom, and are there for extended periods of time to like learn what their teachers are doing and see it in practice. And those children aren't handed off at the door. They're brought into the room. And then there's a slow transition to like, one trusted member of the community to another trusted member of the community. And I think that part of that is, Reggio Emilia is a relatively small city where teachers live in amongst the community and people know them. I think that another part of, our problem is that here in Boston, I can't live anywhere near my school. I can't afford to live over there. And so like, I'm not a part of the community of my children except inside the school building. And so I think in a perfect world where teachers were thriving, we would be living, everybody would be walking distance from their school. Everybody would be seeing their children on the streets. Everybody would be going to parks and, seeing people out in the world and realizing that like the walls of the schools aren't the walls of our lives. Like there's, a lot more going on for each of those people. And, I think there's a lot of disconnection that teachers have too, where they say like, well, I don't understand why parents can't do X. And it's like, well, parents live a very complicated life. And like, they, in order to get their kid to school at 9:00, they've already had probably many hours of the day and many struggles. And then when their kid is here, when we call for a sick child, they're not just sitting at their phone. They're having a day. They're like doing a whole bunch of stuff, and it's like really disruptive. So like, we need to have empathy for those parents in order for them to have empathy for us. Lost track of the question.
I think you really did describe a vision that's centered around thriving. I think,
yeah. I'm having a lot of feelings, like a lot of like emotions just came up as you said all of that. And
Angela, I just want to illustrate for the listeners, like Angela just made these motions with her hands, like there was a fountain coming up through her chest.
And I thought like some thoughts were the way that capitalism works has sort of put us in this moment intentionally, has kept us separated. I got thoughts from a previous conversation about like how it's harmful that we can't be in community with one another, and that like the teachers that are coming into the community space because of the disconnect causes a type of harm. And not necessarily in your context and where we are, but this other conversation was people not having the right, like not voting within the counties that they were voting in was that conversation that came up for me. And then also like how beautiful it would be for me to know the teachers that are downstairs in the preschool building and to know my neighbors. And like there's so much potential when first of all, when you have children, and then when you are entering this school space, because you could create this community space. This is really silly because I usually refrain from talking about my puppy and my new puppy experience. But that also came up for me as you were speaking, because I have met so many of my neighbors now because of this puppy. I mean, the people at the Jamaica Me Hungry by where I live, they know who my puppy is. They like my puppy knows who they are. The people in the next door building, people I would have never spoken to, know who I am because of this puppy. And I think about or what I was thinking about was, how do we, there's so much potential in childcare because of the community building that can happen. And yet there's also so much that keeps us from being able to build those communities and those spaces within our context. And that made me a little bit sad.
Well, I think it's interesting how often capitalism is coming up. I'm very political. Maybe this come through in this conversation. I'm very openly political with my college students and in the classrooms. And I had a parent when I was wearing a DC's the 51st state shirt one day. And I had a parent who was saying mixing education and politics. And I was like, all education is political. You couldn't possibly decouple education and politics if you tried. Like the issue is that this version of politics is maybe not in agreement with yours, and so it seems like it's sticking out. But I think that it all comes back to understanding sort of like the systems that we live in and how like the education system didn't just like grow out of the ground. It was constructed in a very specific way. You know, the American early ed system comes out of slavery. Like it was, there were, you know, enslaved women, well, recently emancipated women and immigrants were the first early ed teachers. And the white women who were doing the exact same job as them were the elementary school teachers. And like that has always been the divide, is that, you know, early ed is a majority minority workforce and a majority women workforce, and elementary school is a significantly whiter workforce and a workforce with more men in it. And so that is the workforce that is part of unions, and that's the workforce that gets summers off, and that's the workforce that has higher pay because they're the ones who are doing the important work of education. Really, these are the same job. It's just the populations that are doing them that are different.
Thank you for that. And for just for listeners and for everybody here, you know, take a breath. If that feels restorative in this moment, you know, we experience these issues firsthand all the time. And when they come into the space spoken, it's just want to give space for people to take a breath and feel where you're at with that, where it's landing for you. Yeah, thanks for calling that in, Wheeler, to the conversation. It is such a, you know, it's a reminder of how far we have to go, right? Go ahead, Angela.
No, I want to dive deeper into that because it's going to lead straight into the work that you do in advocacy, Wheeler, because, and even like you so clearly described where like the racial divide is, and then the thing that came up next for me was even within early childhood education, it is usually white women that get to go and have master's degrees within early childhood education. And it is Black and brown women that have 35 years in the field making $10 an hour, raising many, many children. And how that's also a part of like the systematic divide and how you're valued even within early childhood education.
As we've been, you know, growing the program at BUCC, you know, we've been having a lot of conversations about like qualified resumes. What makes a qualified resume? Because, you know, we're an educational institution. What the hiring part of human resources wants to see is master's degrees.
Right.
And we all know that somebody with 2 years of classroom experience and a master's degree is going to have a lot more trouble onboarding than somebody who's been working in a Head Start in Roxbury for 10 years and is like really been on the ground doing the work and is part of the community. And, so, you know, we have had a lot of conversations, arguments about like who we should really be offering these jobs to and who like is a valued member of the early childhood workforce. And, you know, I think it's clear which side of this divide I land on, but I think, you know, there's a larger problem in the industry of the high prestige early childhood jobs, which are largely at universities, go to people who have master's degrees. And the people who have master's degrees are white women in their mid to late 20s who are going to, you know, who probably got their master's right after their bachelor's, have maybe worked at one or two centers and have, you know, very clear ideas about what their pedagogy is, but who have not had a ton of experience with parent interactions and have not had a ton of experience, you know, operationalizing curriculum and have not had a ton of experience building up a classroom community. And then there's these huge deficits with parents where they're like, whoa, I don't understand why it's so hard to like, you know, communicate with us about changes in the center. It's like, because we hired the people who don't have the experience doing that.
And these are also the women who end up becoming the people that are leading the field.
Yeah.
Right? They are the people that end up with the funding and the organizations that can go and change the field for us.
Right. They're the people who decide that NUIC should make a partnership with Bright Horizons. Like, it's like, what? That's crazy. Like, Bright Horizons is a predatory institution. Like, we should be helping those teachers to get better salaries. We shouldn't be putting Bright Horizons in the seat at the right hand of the National Educational Organization.
Right. 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 I'm going to invite you, Wheeler, to like keep talking about that and a little bit more about your union work and how that looks and what that looked for, like what that process looked like for you, because that's deep. That's deep. It is a huge organization that is making billions of dollars throughout the country. And now they're sitting right next to NACCE, who is the people that we go to for professional development, who our most vulnerable teachers go to for professional development. And it is those organizations that have the power to give people a living wage and yet don't do it because of politics and because they don't have to. And so please.
Well, and have also now, in a lot of places, co-opted the language of high quality care and sort of like, twisted its meaning in these contexts so that like, yes, the Bright Horizons is now giving like an emergent curriculum, but like, is it really an emergent curriculum? Are those teachers
without planning time?
Right, exactly, with no planning time. And those teachers aren't being given time to observe those children and, have meetings with each other where they're then, co-constructing meaning and out of those observations and then turning it into that emergent curriculum. So is it really emergent curriculum, or is it just the buzzword of emergent curriculum that, Bright Horizons now can say like, oh, well, we're a high quality institution because we do X. And I'm sure that there are lots of Bright Horizons are franchised. I'm sure that there are lots of them that are doing excellent work, but I have been in lots of them where like there are people who are drowning because there's these incredibly high expectations, because doing the work of early childhood is very difficult, even if you're well prepared. And so they're, not necessarily well prepared, not necessarily well resourced, and doing it on the ground without the support of the institution.
Right.
We were talking a little bit about our union. We recently unionized at BUCC. Formed with SEIU. I'm actually wearing my local shirt right now.
Okay.
And that was a big step. It's something that I have been in the field now for almost 15 years. And at every center I've worked at, there's been somebody who's agitating for a union and trying to figure it out. And because of the pandemic and because of, the teacher shortage, the national teacher shortage, we felt like we were finally in a position to like say, hey, you guys need us more than we need this job. Like we can go and find another job if we have to. And so that sort of gave us the courage to, get off the starting mark and go and form our union. And it's been a real learning process. Like I'm somebody who comes from a multi-generationally union family. Like, my grandfather came here as a hod carrier, somebody who carries bricks and mortar on their back. He probably, and he eventually worked at Scoville's, which is the brass mill in Waterbury, and was a union member there, and was able to buy a house and have a family in a way that he probably would not have without union support. And we in the US have really devalued, and again, it's not organic, it's intentional. Unions have been devalued by the people who have the power to make those decisions. And it has, created this tremendous wealth inequality in the US. There was a Business Insider article a couple of weeks ago where they were talking about how wages and growth have been decoupled since 1968, and how if they were still coupled together, the average wage in the US would be $102,000.
Huh.
And that is because of the bleeding of unions, isolating workers, making them, feel like they don't have the power to stand up for, better working conditions, better wages, more respect in the workplace. And early ed is sort of at the cutting edge of that because, again, of its majority minority status. It's, very often taken advantage of. And we, again, it's very funny because I work for a gigantic research institution, and we have a lot of money and we have a lot of resources. Our center is beautiful and our teachers are well taken care of. And so people often ask well, why do you need to unionize? It's everybody needs to unionize. Like we need to create a wall of solidarity amongst all workers so that we can never be taken advantage of again. And it is easier for us to unionize and hopefully create momentum and a blueprint for the people who actually need it, the people who are working in Little Sprouts and KinderCare and Bright Horizons for, $10.50 an hour and, desperately trying to find something that they're going to be able to pay their rent with. Those are the people who need to unionize, but we are the people who can unionize. And so we have been having a lot of conversations with SEIU specifically about like how to build broader movements and how to, take this very white, very well-educated workforce that we're unionizing at Boston University and use it as an example of what can be done elsewhere. And I wish those conversations had been more productive than they have been, but it's definitely something that we're still working on. There was in April of this year, there's a research institution at Cal Berkeley, the Center for the Study of the Childcare Employment, and they put out a document. It's like 15 pages long, and it's a blueprint for what strategies centers can use to unionize. And it's actually geared toward unions. So saying like, hey, unions, here's what you need to know when you're unionizing early childhood workers. And it's very interesting. It got absolutely no press when it came out.
Yeah.
So it's definitely worth a look. I can send a link to you too, so that you can maybe put.
That would be great. We put it in the show notes.
Yeah, because it's very instructive. It's very clear. There's here are the benefits, here are the risks, here are the relevant laws, and a big part of sort of unionizing is explaining to people what unions can do for them. There's a lot of magical thinking around unions, like, oh, well, when we're unionized, we're not going to have to, do twice a year assessments anymore. And it's like, well, no, that's a state law. Like, that's a licensing requirement. Like, that's not a union thing. But the unions are going to be able to make sure that we are involved in choosing what our assessments look like through joint labor management meetings, because that's a condition of our work environment. And so that's something that our management has to negotiate with us when we're unionized, but they don't when we're not.
That's like, we think of movements, and we're in this moment in early childhood education that's maybe not new, but feels new because of a global pandemic, right? Like, it's so in our face. It's not anything new, but it's very much in our face. And we're in a moment also in early childhood education where there's money coming in, and it's not the gazillion trillions of dollars that other corporations and organizations and sectors get, but it is a lot. We are getting a lot more than we've ever gotten before.
Well, and it's frustrating because we have grants, so we can buy things, but we can't give our teachers raises. Like, we've bought so much playground equipment. Like, we could not possibly buy all of the playground equipment we have the grant money for, but we can't give teachers enough money so that they can live in Brighton instead of the North Shore and have to take the train into work.
Right. And I think I'm thinking about like this work, this union work, this community work, like that's the part of the movements that really push us over the edge of making a national shift or making a shift in the field, like this in the between space, right? Because we have people that are like, we're not doing this work. We're going to go do our own thing. We're going to go build our own systems, our own schools, not related. And we have other people that are like just in it, like they don't even know where they're at. They're just like, we're just going to keep this train rolling. And then there's like this middle work that you're really, really describing. And that's the middle work that that the cake needs to rise, right? Like that the dough, like that you need to move. Be about the way cakes rise.
Well, and it's so fraught because with the power of the charter school movement, especially in Massachusetts, it is so easy for somebody who is a great preschool teacher to say, I wash my hands of this entire process. I'm going to go be a kindergarten teacher in a charter school, and I'm going to get a $30,000 raise on day one, and I'm going to get summers off. And sure, that charter school is sucking all of the money out of its community, and sure, that charter school has canned curriculum that I hate, but it's going to make my quality of life so much better. And we, as sort of the thinkers in early childhood, need to figure out how to give people the benefit of the freedom of practice that we have in early ed, but not having to take a vow of poverty to do it.
You just a $30,000 pay bump.
Yeah.
That's a lot. That's just for the listeners, if you can grasp that, $30,000 more on day one, you don't need to go and go through all of the tiers to be able
we
to
just lost 50 more early childhood educators.
But that's where we are in the decisions that we make. I mean, one of the reasons I don't go back into the classroom is because I would be taking a $30,000, $35,000, $40,000 pay cut.
Yeah.
That's a quality of life.
With a master's degree.
With a master's degree.
Yeah.
With a master's degree.
Wow. It's been such a rich conversation. I feel like next year we need to have part 2. And I think, Wheeler, that you have already answered our last question about practical tools, guides, and framework. This episode was really rich in the really tangible tools throughout. Thank you so much. If there's anything else that you want to add.
One tool that I want to plug.
Ooh,
I have a lot of conversations about classroom management and what classroom management means with teachers. And those conversations can get really sort of didactic and power struggle-y. And there's a writer who I really love who I don't know why she isn't more mainstream, Claire Cherry. She was doing her writing in the 70s and 80s. So her books are a little bit dated, but they're about sort of embracing the whole child and then using that whole child as your image in classroom management and managing your classroom without squishing your kids' personalities. And everybody, she has 2 great books. Please Don't Sit on the Kids and Think of Something Quiet. Yeah. And every teacher, they're both very, very short. You could read them in a month of nap times. You could get through them. Every teacher should check them out. They're unfortunately out of print, so they're a little hard to find, but get one copy and then pass it around your center.
All right. Thank you. Well, that sounds like roots for the work that I do. So I need to go back. Thank you so much for joining us today.
So great to talk to you, too.
With you. Yeah. And to our listeners, thanks for listening. To keep the conversation going and for monthly reflection prompts related to each episode, sign up for our mailing list.
If you want to play with us in real time, exploring the ideas in this episode, please come to the next Campfire Chat. We look forward to our next sacred conversation with you.
Check out the show notes for details.